It's going to be a panel about network automation. Three amazing speakers here, three amazing panelists. So on my left, we have Mark Coleman. He's the co-founder, chief evangelist of NetBox Labs, right? In the middle, though you said that you didn't like to be in the middle, we have Jason Edelman from Network Decode. He's the founder and CTO. And then on the very left, we have Damien Garros, who is the CEO and co-founder of OpsMill. Okay, so the format that we're going to have here is we're going to separate it into blocks. The first block is going to be roughly half of the time, 25 minutes. I'm going to throw some topics on the table. Please feel free to go completely off topic because it's way more interesting what you have in mind than what I'm going to ask. And then we're going to have maybe 15 minutes of questions by the audience. And then we're going to repeat that cycle for the second part. So really the first block is going to be more about your experience with network automation, how it all started, and a little bit of source of truth, so on. And the second part more on the future. There's going to be an AI question, of course. So let's see. So without further ado, let's start with a sort of an introductory topic. I mean, how did you start, or where did you start with network automation? What's your story, right? What's your background? And really, what is also the mission of your affiliations, your companies? So who wants to start?
Sure. How is this? Can you hear me okay? Yes, I'll start on the overall journey that I had years ago and kind of bring it back to Network Decode. But yeah, for one, I love telling this story, and I'll try to keep it as short as I can. But if we go back to 2012 and 13, there was so much hype in the industry around SDN, and I was kind of talk about there was so much money getting thrown into SDN startups to transform networking when there was really a gap in operational models. APIs on devices, Python on a switch, and all those things. And so it was some early on focus with looking at tools like Ansible on network devices, looking at how to use APIs on switches. And at the time, Cisco had just announced, or it was in the middle of using 1PK. Back in the day, it was their first SDK for network devices. And I always joke. I remember 20 years ago, Googling, looking for scripts and templates, and I can never find them. And so 1PK was just so profound to transform the industry, and that was sort of telling to me that there was still no company focused on transforming how networks were operated. That became the foundation to start Network Decode in 2014 with the mission to really just do that. We've been on that mission ever since, 10.5 years, and through training, professional services, managed services, we launched Nautirbot in 2021. We just celebrated its 4th birthday, and now we continue on that mission and do that with Nautirbot at our side.
I can go. 20 years ago, you were looking into script? I'm kidding. That would be 2005, 2005?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
I couldn't find any.
Yeah, for sure.
I look younger than I.
We're old, but we're not that old. So I guess for me, the story started actually 2010. I was an SC at Juniper, and I was selling data center switches. And because we had Junos and actually had already amazing automation capability, very quickly it became very clear for me that I was helping my customer designing their networks. We were trying to find solutions and design that would solve their problem. And very quickly, it became clear that all this automation capability on the box were just one other tools in my tool belt to actually solve their problem. And at the time, I remember, the automation was actually like Slack scripts on Junos, which was pretty ugly. But that worked. We were able to solve an amazing problem. And then from there, I went and started looking at Ansible and looking at all those tools. I think very quickly, two things became very clear to me is that, automation is mostly a data management problem. And so the first challenge of capturing the intent was something, I very quickly felt very passionate about and working on. And the other one is how we couple that with the observability topic. For me, I think it's been the two main topics I've been working on. The talk that David gave earlier was really, I think a very good summary of how it's important to actually target both and to make sure that we have the data from the source of truth and the intents to actually correlate with the observability tool. And at some point I get to a point where actually I was offered the opportunity to work either in the observability space or in the source of truth space. And I decided that there was so much more to do yet in this space. I feel like, I've been working in NetBox since 2017, I think. And then I was working with Jason. I was part of the team that started Nanobot. And I felt like there was still so much more to do in the source of truth space that felt to me that was the most pressing problem to solve. So decided to start OpsMill and try to take a different approach of this problem with InfraHub.
Hello. Okay, it works good. So I got started, I started my career as a software engineer. I really wanted to be John Carmack from id Software and make like Doom and Quake. And when I went to study computer science, in our second year, we did this personality test one day. It was like part of a team exercise where you have to do a personality test, and then they take the results from the personality test and they map it onto IT and tell you what kind of job you want. And I thought it was going to say rockstar developer, but what it said was configuration manager. And I was like, what the hell is a configuration manager? So maybe it's part of my personality, but in my career I've gone from, I basically automated a bunch of stuff. I started out, I actually went into video games, did the developer thing for a while, but then I ended up automating tests, and then after that I ended up automating servers, and then networks, and then VMs, and then containers, and everything else. I landed at NetBox because I was working at Equinix. I actually came in through Packet, which was like a bare metal cloud, and we were doing a bunch of stuff. We got a thumbs up for Packet or for Equinix? Yeah, I thought so. I thought so, yeah. So we were doing a bunch of stuff because they had the need to basically lifecycle bare metal servers the way you would a VM. So all sorts of interesting challenges with networks and iPixie and fun things like that. And when we were doing that, we were looking for somewhere to store all of our infrastructure data, and we found NetBox. So I ended up working with that a little bit. And then I left Equinix, and I met a guy called Chris Beavers, who ran a company at the time called NS1, where Jeremy Stretch from NetBox had also started. So in 2022, I went there to help build the NetBox business. In 2023, that span out and became NetBox Labs, and now we're a separate company. So we're focused on scaling that and a lot of the problems we're going to talk about today.
Very good. Thank you. Was an interesting. I was not expecting that level of detail actually from this question, but it was really, really interesting. So in terms of, and let's get into the topic, right? Network automation per se. I mean, and let's perhaps start with the state of adoption, right? I mean, I've heard different opinions about this topic, but we have been talking about network automation for the last decade or more. So from your perspective, where do we stand in terms of adoption? And also, are there specific parts of the network or specific environments where network automation is perhaps more difficult to implement?
Yeah, I'll have a go. Maybe we can pass this one around a little bit, because I think that's a pretty big question. So, I mean, certainly what we see is that the majority of the market is still at the beginning of their journey. So I think we did some research with a guy called Seamus McGillicuddy at Enterprise Management Associates at the beginning of last year. I was trying to figure out, like, where are people on this spectrum? And at the time, it was like most people still don't really have a good sense of what's in their infrastructure. In fact, when we do prospect calls at NetBox Labs, as an icebreaker question, we like to ask, would you say that your infrastructure is 100% documented? And everyone starts laughing, and then we can get on with the rest of the call. So I think the majority of the market is still right at the beginning. You know, we see all sorts of users coming from spreadsheets, from other tools, like PHP IPAM, rack tables, all sorts of interesting stuff. But as with all of these things, like with DevOps and like with cloud native and like everything that came before it, it's a really long tail. So we also see incredibly advanced organizations that are doing everything right. Obviously, all the usual names, like the FANG companies, but then a lot around them. And I think that that is a trend that we will see play out here. Like, I think network automation is going to become a big hype, and then it'll calm back down. And what we'll see is, even after that, some companies still won't be very good at it, but a larger number of companies will have made some progress.
Maybe I have a way to see that, at least that's the way we've been talking about it internally, is, to me, network automation is like if we do the parallel with the car industry, the network automation platform that everyone is trying to build is like a car, that will take you from A to B, where today you're probably on a horse or on foot. And I think if we make the parallel, we're in the situations today where no one is buying a car. No one is selling a car. There's no car manufacturer. So we're at the point where if you want a car, you have to build it entirely on your own. And there's not even a blueprint that tells you how to build the car. I think, to me, that's the state of the industry. At best, you can acquire some parts for the car, but most likely you're going to have to build some of the parts on your own all the way through. So it requires an amount of efforts to actually be able to build that car. And I think that's aligned with what Mark was saying, that there's some most advanced players that have been able to build those cars because they put a lot of resources behind it, and they're able to do that. But to me, as an industry, like I said, the three of us here, we're building an engine. So we're building solutions that are a part of that car, that are making it easy to do that, but we're still seeing a lot of people that are actually building the car on their own, like an engine on their own. Most organizations, I think I've seen, that are the most advanced in automation, most likely they build their own engine, they build their own source of truth, they build their own stuff on their own, so it's just so high. So my hope is that as an industry, we'll start basically have more car manufacturers, we'll have more parts that will be more mature, that will be have more standard integrations between all those parts so that you don't have to rebuild everything on your own. And then, in a few years, the amount of efforts it takes to actually get those cars will be much, much lower. It will probably take, 5 to 10 years to get there, but that will be my reading of the situation.
Cool. Yeah, I'll jump in. I'd be curious on the discussion too of cars, looking at like vertically integrated versus horizontally composable, and trying to get to that point with so many different types of networks. It is good to think about. But I would say even going back to 10 years ago, it was always interesting, right? Launching Network Code and Cisco DevNet around the same time where they were born, and now DevNet sort of I guess maybe winding down. But I only bring them up because I think it was actually critical for the for the industry to learn some of these skills, right? Like, they did a great job to sort of evangelize learning APIs and JSON, YAML, XML, Python, Ansible, right? All these tools. But I would say, in hindsight, in the reality, I think we sort of have now probably thousands of engineers, that are like CCNA level, sort of trying to adopt network automation. And so I think as an industry, we're in a better spot because I think we're seeing a lot of these like power tools get built, which do show where problems exist in an organization. But there still is like a lack of like architectural approach. Maybe that kind of dovetails into what Damien was saying. But like an architectural approach to adopt automation. So yeah, I think if this was, I was going to say a baseball game, but I know I'm in Spain. Baseball's not as common.
Baseball?
Yeah.
Basketball.
But we're a quarter into the game where we're looking at sort of like we now know source of truth is a main component. Right, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, like that wasn't a topic. That was a topic of maybe 5%. Now we know it's a main topic. So we're seeing some of the building blocks that that are needed. So I do think the last 5 to 7 years it was a lot of skills learning. But the next 5 to 7, I think it's going to be a lot more about repeatability and even more right when we see the growth of AI, which we'll get to, I guess maybe later.
No, I think we can move on.
Maybe a follow-up question on this analogy of the car, right? I mean, do you think this is because the problem space is too big? It's because there are so many different vendors, there are so many different, essentially, scenarios that you have to cover, or there are other reasons for this?
I don't know if the space is too big, but I think we've been underestimating how complex it is. Like, I think the truth is it's a very complex problem, and without any offense, I think we just expect like network engineers to learn some skills and to automatically become software architects. And I'm one of them, so I went through that journey, but I think realistically it's unrealistic to actually expect that. I think it's just a new field. Like, we need to build new skills. We need to have more software architects to build those platforms. We need to, in the same way we take the cars, like we're gonna have people that will design the components, we'll have mechanics that will be really good at fixing them and integrating them, and we'll have people that will just drive the car, and then we'll never have to worry about how they works inside the engine. It will take 10 years to get there, but I think we're just having this expectation that people can just learn everything. Like today, it's very, very unrealistic. Expecting someone to know all of networking, all of DevOps, all of software engineering, all of like to actually build those platforms. It's actually amazing that few of us have managed to do that, but it's just, yeah, I don't think it's sustainable for the industry to build that, to expect like that.
Yeah, I will say kind of if I remember giving a presentation at Interop, I think it was like 2016 or 18, talking about self-driving cars, and it was around like, go component by component as cars did. And I would admit, I was in California a few weeks ago for a customer visit. It was my first time ever in an FSD, a full self-driving car. That was a Tesla. I was in the back seat. It was a customer that was driving the car, and my mind was blown. It was really, it was really insane to be a part of that sort of, technology. But I will say, not to simplify self-driving cars, because it's an amazing feat. But yeah, networks, I think they are complex. They're distributed. There's different types of networks. We saw it with even where you spent time at Apstra years ago, sort of like turnkey, closed loop, just for the data center, pre-built fabrics. You couldn't change it, and just sort of like things are complex. And I wouldn't want to say I couldn't build a car, right? But I wouldn't say that it's hard. One's harder than the other. But we have decades of technology. We have greenfield. We have brownfield, and so many types of networks. So it is definitely a complex system to go out and get to the point where we can have like a solid self-driving network, right?
I'll just add that I agree. Like I think it's the hardest. It's the hardest thing to automate. Like if you look at just my journey, right? Like first I was just like, why are we doing all these tests manually? Let's automate them. Great. It's all software. That's fantastic. Then it was VMs. Well, that's all software too. Then it was containers. That's all software too. The minute it got hard was when we started touching bare metal servers, and it's like, wait a minute, these have the vendors upgrade the firmware, and I can't do anything about that. Or like, it's really hard to apply. I mean, we can take a lot from DevOps and continuous delivery and everything that came before, but you can't just virtualize a core router and have 20 of them. I mean, you can have container lab, right? But you still got to deploy the thing eventually. It's got a lot of like really unique challenges in it, and I think I'm going to try and extend the car analogy. Like the road is very bumpy. And it's very bumpy because, maybe like you're driving along and everything's smooth, and then now you got to use vendor X and it's not so smooth anymore. So it has really unique challenges in it that make today, well, to both the points from earlier, it explodes the complexity because it makes things more difficult.
Anything else you want to add on this? Kind of related to this, right? I mean, someone was alluding to skills, right? And I think there has been a shift in what network administrators are actually learning, but there seems to be still a gap between what they are today learning and what is going to be needed in the future. And if we mix any AI, that probably is even, the gap is bigger, right? But in your opinion, what are the skills that network operators need to gain today?
If I may, I think it's the wrong question.
You think it's the wrong question? Great.
Yes. The first question is, what are the roles that we're going to need tomorrow? Because the skill can only be mapped to a role. And I think before talking skills, we should talk about the roles. And then we can talk about what are the skills for each of those roles. But
which roles do you think are today that are not going to be the same in the
I
near
think
future?
what we mentioned earlier is like network automation architect, network automation software developers, or I don't know how we call them. Like there's actually a lot of roles that don't exist today in our field that we're going to have to create, and they will have a set of skills that will be different from the other one, like network reliability engineers. Like again, we can throw a lot of them at. I think the first thing that's going to change is the number of roles will expand. There's new roles that will be created. And I personally do not believe that network engineers will all need to become network automation architects. I don't think that's true. Some of them will, because they're really good and they want to learn and they're excited about it. But not everyone, like I think said that a network automation engineers in this new world will still need different skills. And again, we can talk about that, but I think first thing is, I don't think everyone realized that there's a lot of new roles. And personally, it's been very frustrating because I think at Network to Code and when I was Network Code, put a lot of efforts into actually really becoming network automation architects. And sometimes we go to customers and feel like the guy that learned Python 2 years ago, which is the most advanced in automation in the team, just got promoted architect. And everyone is looking at it like, oh, he's the guy that knows everything about automation, he's gonna fix all our problem. And you realize how much he still doesn't have had a chance to learn. Because again, it's a learning journey, I'm not smarter than him, it's just, I just got the opportunity to start on it earlier and failed so many times that we learned it the hard way. But I feel like there's just, as an industry, the lack of realization that it's just a new role and it's not about someone that learned Python, it's so much more than that. And I think we're still learning. Honestly, I'm learning every day. I would not pretend that I know everything about it by any means. It's not what I'm saying.
Yeah, there's a few things trying to keep them straight, but I've always given an answerable example for some things Damien is saying, that I think if you kind of envision a world where Ansible is being used, like you're going to have a role that people are just running playbooks. Then you might have a role that is creating playbooks, and you might have a role where customers are building custom modules. And even to build a custom module, you don't have to be a senior software engineer, right? You can be maybe an automation engineer and go beyond that to build libraries, more complex systems. So even there's like three or four roles. But what I will say, somebody made a joke to me probably several years ago around, and it's kind of not the best joke, because we've all been in networking for so long, but it's like network engineers who have been so used to getting handed like design guides from large manufacturers, and the systems folks had more of sort of like a clean slate to think about solving problems without pre-canned design guides. So I do think like skills I think about that aren't as technical, it really is a bit more like systems thinking, understand the components. And even without getting hands-on per se, just really understand the problem you're trying to solve. And I think when diving in, it is so easy to go pick a tool to go dive in. But I would force, this is myself in my day-to-day, or it could be an engineer's day-to-day, but like what are the challenges that somebody has? How would you go about fixing them, or what does success look like? To think about then how you might go solve them versus like picking a tool first. So I do think we've been in a very tools first industry for a long time, and I would just challenge us to be systems thinkers. Like think about the problem, think about the outcome, and then sort of have an architecture or even high level before you kind of go in and try to tackle it.
Is it on? It's on. Yeah, I think I kind of agree about the tools thing, but at the same time, I think what happens in these industries is specialization. So if you think about like how long it takes to become a really good software engineer, like a really good software engineer, 20 years, like world class if you try really hard. Probably about the same for a network engineer, right? If you really want to show off, it's going to take you a lot of time, maybe 10 years. So the idea that we're going to have, a large enough number of people who are both of those things, to Damien's point about roles, is not realistic, right? Like that's not going to happen. What happened with DevOps is a whole bunch of people who were previously software engineers learned what a host name was, right? Or a DNS record or stuff like that. And some of them got really good at it and they got both the hats, but you saw this sort of movement from software engineer towards what would then have been called something like sysadmin. And the same on the other side, right? People who are running servers figured out, okay, maybe I should stop using Perl scripts and maybe I should actually start organizing my code, right? And some of them got really good at that. But ultimately, there's never enough people who are going to wear both hats to do those things. So that's where specialization comes in. And I think that's where tools can be useful. There's a reason why I'm now able to run like fully networked VMs all over the planet without ever being able to build that myself. And it's because Amazon does it for me. Right? So the way that we close those skill gaps sometimes is tools come in and they say you don't actually have to know all that anymore because you can rely on some of these patterns, some of these existing tools. And I think that's probably what we'll see here too.
So let me ask a follow-up question, trying to challenge also what you just said, right? I mean, in the DevOps, you mentioned a transition from software engineering or software development as a generic career to the DevOps. Do you see a way, of path to fill some of these roles that you were describing from different roles, software engineers, pure network engineers, and what are these paths to go into these new roles? Is it all software engineers that are going to become that are going to fill most of these new roles?
I think it's hard to say, but I probably a mix. I definitely see network engineers that put a lot of efforts into learning observability and software, and that become really good at it, and that are fantastic, like network reliability engineers, network automation architects, network developers, software developers. I've seen all sort of transition. I think everything is possible, like if you put the efforts into it and you're interested by this field. Again, not everyone is interested to become a software developer. I think that's the main, and that's fair. Not everyone has to learn that. Having said that, there's one thing maybe I've seen is, I think every industry nowadays requires some level of scripting. I think scripting has been very helpful in every industry because you always have to manipulate some data. And to me, it's actually a very different skill set than software developer. Like, you can be really good at scripting, you know some languages, you understand data model, and you can manipulate data and do some actions in a simple way. And we've seen that in the data industry. Again, even in finance. Right now, we actually have our finance guy at OpsMill that is learning how to consume data from APIs to solve finance problem. So that skill, I think everyone should learn that. And I think in this engineering industry, in the network industry, there's a lot of people that have been pushing back saying, I don't want to become software developer. And I don't see that scripting and software developers are actually two very different fields. And that I think scripting is definitely going to become critical. But to me, it's very different than the guy that's actually going to write the full automation stack.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would just think about like the roles and giving analogies to maybe where current network teams are, even looking at network operations, as I was saying earlier, in the sense of like Ansible as an example. It's like today, if there's 10 new tickets that are opened, and there's an issue of reachability or performance, there's probably a troubleshooting guide that they follow, right? I would say presently in certain environments or in the future, like that converts into some automation to diagnose it, and maybe an engineer in the beginning runs that automation or that workflow. When that breaks, then what happens? Like, should they have to open a ticket to a different team to fix it, or should that operator have some skills to be able to optimize and fix it? So, yeah, I would agree. I would, in the sense of with all the roles that we see, it does seem like the baseline is going to change, right? A baseline of scripting, Linux, version control, right? Some of these things seem like they're going to be the new baseline for network engineers. I think like the level of software, yeah, I think it's going to vary quite a bit in the sense of, if you're a smaller organization or a Fortune 100 with like the amount of roles and teams you might have, right, in the sense security and governance and, data and all these types of, different areas. But otherwise, yeah, so you have your baseline skills that are pervasive. Maybe it's not a new title, right? Is that a network engineer of the future? Is that a different title? But I do think those that are writing software, like there will be different roles based on where they, based on their expertise, right?
I'll just add one. It's back on again. I'll just add one clarification, which is I don't think for a minute that like software engineers are going to come and take over everything. And the reason why is because it didn't happen in DevOps. And it's because if you think about how hard it is to learn software engineering versus how hard it is to learn network engineering, it's a lot harder to learn network engineering because nobody's going to let you run their network if you're a software engineer, right? But anyone can learn to software because you can do it on your laptop. You don't need permission from anybody. Right? So what we see, especially with a lot of the most prominent innovators in these industries, is that they came from the domain and learned to code. Now, it happens the other way around. Occasionally software people turn up, they go, what the hell is going on here, let me fix it. But more often, it's people who are in the domain that learn how to scale their skills through code that make the biggest impacts.
Yeah, can I add to it? Yeah, I was gonna say, even DevOps, background, I remember hearing talks from John Willis, who's been around the DevOps space for a really long time, and he'd give examples, I guess going back to maybe 2010s, I think it was Bill's scripts, right? You go into a room, talk about how they're automating, and there's like, Bill would always be in the room, kind of arms crossed, and Bill's scripts were Bill's scripts. No one can run Bill's scripts. If somebody else ran it and they broke, no one could fix it except Bill. And then John Willis joined the networking company, and it sort of, I think Bill became Bob maybe, or maybe it was the opposite way around. And nowadays, I still think certain organizations have that one person in the room, in the sense, like they might, be kind of hoarding like their scripts and automation. I think the answer to the DevOps space at the time, it was sort of like Puppet, Chef, Ansible, Salt, because like there became frameworks on how to automate without learning software development in the networking space. I think like some of those frameworks, and again, we have 3 different platforms on the stage here. I think we're trying to lower that barrier to entry and create more frameworks and patterns. And I think when we do, like, we'll be able to better evolve ourselves in the industry.
Anything else on this topic? So let's maybe see if there are questions from the audience on these topics or some other topics. I mean, it doesn't have to be specifically on this, but don't touch AI. AI is coming, right? So,
thank you. So for the part about software developers not necessarily becoming network engineers, I think like one big thing blocking a lot more people going into network engineering and understanding this field is that testing, if it works, has always been a second-class citizen in this whole area, right? Because for software, it's very easy to test if it works. There's frameworks for testing, there's simulations, blah, blah, blah. For networking, if you have a proper networking with a couple hundred routers, whatever else, as you said, nobody's gonna like let a software engineer just run that because it's way too dangerous. You might break it. But that's an issue that should be solvable by actually allowing people to test if there are improvements, if there are changes, whatever else, during the learning process, right? I mean, like NetBox and NetReplica, for example, this whole idea of like creating a digital twin and then allowing to test, that's gonna open up a whole new idea of testing, and I think that's then probably going to bring in a lot more people from software development into this field. So I would be interested in seeing like how does this change this idea of software developers, or you talking about DevOps and stuff like that, coming into this?
Well, I think that was primarily at me, but I'll definitely ask for some input from Damien and Jason. So I think like we're seeing the same patterns play out. Like what do you need to do when you're testing something? You need reproducibility, immutability, idempotency, all of these kind of things, right, to make it easier. Now, when did Docker arrive? 2014? Like before that, testing software itself was harder. Now, right, like when Docker turned up, all the software engineers or people who've been trying to test stuff were like, this is unbelievable. All the ops people were like, it doesn't do storage or networking. What are you talking about, right? Like, but the people who have been trying to solve those problems got it quickly. Only 2-3 years ago, there was no container lab, right? So you're spinning up event-g, and you're running these massive VMs, and it's all slow, right? So things are changing really quickly here, but it's the same patterns over and over again. I would also say that, it's not like in the sort of super easy software world we test the entire global software like setup, right? We break it up and we test smaller parts. So I think there's a lot we can lean on there, which is like testing composability, the testing pyramid, all that kind of theory that we can use here as well, where we test subsections of networks. And I think the tooling's arriving. Like, Container Lab certainly revolutionized how we go about doing this kind of testing. You mentioned NetReplica. Give that a shout out because that's an amazing open source tool. But that idea of being able to take something from a network source of truth, whether it's NetBox, Multibot, or InfraHub, and then being able to extract small parts of that so that you can create a testing scenario is like possible now. So I think probably what we'll see, despite the bumpy road analogy that I used earlier, is that we'll probably be able to take advantage of best practices from software engineering faster in network automation, because we're kind of solving some problems, but leaning on a lot of, like, standing on a lot of shoulders, the shoulders of giants kind of thing, yeah. But curious to know what you guys think.
Yeah, I'll jump in and quick, so I agree with a lot of that, but I was going to say, yeah, networking, like there is the cost of the infrastructure, which I think has caused a big issue. And Container Lab definitely helps, but there's still, the quote-unquote risk of, in the sense of that not matching production in large backbones. But at the end of the day, I think things are improving, but, just looking at like the last literally 10 plus years, it's just sort of like, we as an industry have to demand more from the vendors that are out there, in the sense of like have software distributions or software VMs or containers to be able to allow us to test. And they're getting better, there's more of them. But when you think about domain managers and controllers, can we go put in, I don't know, a Cisco ACI or a Big IQ or Panorama and Palo to fully certify? Some have VMs, right? Some might not. A shout out, right, to Hedgehog and Sonic in the room. I'm sure testing for their stuff is way easier. So I think in general, buyers have to continue to vote with their paychecks or their funds that they have to demand more from the manufacturers and the vendors. But we are starting to see what's possible, and so not really too much more to say.
Two thoughts on that question. First one is, I don't think testing software is that easy. I think testing a single piece of software is easy. Testing a distributed system is actually quite complicated. I'm doing it every day. It's not easy. And I think networks by definition is a distributed system. So by definition, I think there was a statement that, but the other point is, it's kind of opening a new topic, but when I hear all of that, I think there's one thing for me that we're really missing in this field is version control. And I think it's been a big topic in the last year, and I'd love for us to talk about it, because I think this is actually what is also making testing easier, because we can have prepared changes in isolated environments and actually validate a lot of things, have CI/CD pipelines, and now it's actually becoming possible to have that in our field, because that technology is coming to the different source of truth in the system. I think that's very exciting. I hope you have questions on that.
It's the next one. That's good. More questions from the audience?
Yeah. It's not quite a question. It's I will ask for advice. I'm a software engineer student on my 4th year, so this year hopefully I end my studies. But I want to be a network engineer, and it's not easy to find jobs that let you enter and try anything on its network. So I want a little bit of advice on my next steps about maybe studying a master or having certifications or just entering the first job I found. Thanks.
Were you saying you're majoring in CS right now, computer science, and you want to look for jobs as a network engineer?
I'm mastering software engineering, and I want to find a job on network engineering.
Okay. Yeah. Again, I don't want to go down too deep, but I'd probably say broaden it a little bit, in the sense of like the network industry again, maybe it's because of the titles and roles that we're saying right now. I would look at like network automation engineers, or there's software engineer, common networking, like those types of titles. But I think again, look, having been a part of hiring for the past several years, having people coming out of university that have software experience, if it's even companies like Hedgehog in the back, and sort of like being sort of like native software to get into networking, I think opportunities are endless. So I think to me, like the title network engineer seems too limiting based on what you can do with your experience already. I'd probably look at like the broader ecosystem of like DevOps, NRE, automation engineers, and understanding you're going to have to learn networking data models and infrastructure along the way.
Take Container Lab and start playing with it. That's, to me, the best advice.
And I would say don't, like, the thing about software engineering is that it's a meta skill, right? So network engineering is a domain skill, right? Like fixing networks. Software engineering is a meta skill. It's just for automating different domains. So you could be a software engineer with networks, you could be a software engineer with submarines. It doesn't really matter. It's been like the best bet degree to have for the last 30 years. I wouldn't walk away from it too soon, but I would, and I think like to the earlier point, there's so many opportunities to get closer to the networking domain as a software engineer that you can go work for a networking vendor and do something for them, right? Or like find some way to be close to that problem domain, because at some point you might want to move to another one, and you don't want to kind of leave the software engineering skills behind, because they will apply to many different domains over the course of your career.
I fully agree with that, and I'm actually surprised when you say you're struggling to find a role. I also said everyone would want to have the software engineers that want to learn networking. Like that's honestly, I think there's so many use cases you could do like that, where you cannot harm anything, you cannot break anything. Like there's so many use cases around troubleshooting, around providing more visibility. Like if you're not trying to push changes, and even automation tools, there's as long as you build your tools in a way that are safe and human controlled, and you always have a human that will validate any change that will be made on the environments, I feel like, people, I mean, it's an entire different topic, but if it's built right, I don't see why that would be a problem.
I think there's a part that Barcelona doesn't have a big ecosystem of these kind of companies. So networking here is present. There are several companies that are doing networking projects. There are not so many. So my advice would be, there's a few of them. Get in touch with people in NetBCN, like me, like Christian, like Paolo. We know some of those. But also try to look for positions outside of Spain, because there are many companies that hire remote and have very interesting.
Yeah, our 3 companies up here, I'm sure.
And one more thing to add, because I get this question quite a lot from graduates, is that, like, despite the fact that computer science is an incredibly valuable degree, there are lots of people with that degree. So anything you can do to stand out really helps. And the number one way to do that is do a bunch of projects and put them on GitHub, so that when I'm speaking to you in your interview, I've already read your code and I have an idea of what you're doing. Like, try and be as visible as possible, because like I said, computer science masters especially is very valuable, but there's a lot of you, so stand out somehow.
Yeah, I was going to say, last piece of maybe advice, if it's advice, is I've said to a lot of folks that I've worked with in the past, and maybe as interns, is know the why, right? Know the why of why we're building something. And the second piece is, like, ideally become part of how money is made. And I say that because, again, like software engineers and R3 companies, or even the 4 that spoke today, like network software is how we make money, versus if you're building software internally and it's a call center, it is different. It can change a career right overnight. So I would say be cognizant of value and how the business makes money, and try to align to that. That would be great. And I'll leave with that.
Okay. More questions? Freddy's standing out, but doesn't have a question. Okay. Source of truth. It's a time. Okay, so really, free topic. I mean, approach it however you want. I mean, maybe the question would be, it's trying to be a little bit controversial, right? I mean, do you think that all the automation platforms need to integrate the source of truth or not? And the second part of the question, which is related to the data in the source of truth, what are the biggest challenges in populating the source of truth and maintaining that data consistency that you have seen?
That was two questions in one, I think, right?
Do you want? You can also tackle first the first one. I mean, and then the second one.
Well, what was the first one? More of the integration of data and,
So
and automation.
the first question is if the automation platform has to have a source of truth built in, or it doesn't have to.
This one is specific. You had to invite different people. Like you invited 3 people, building source of truth. So I guess the answer is yes.
I'll be the contrarian. Absolutely unnecessary source of truth. It's a waste of time. Don't worry about it. Move on.
Yeah, well, yeah, I could try to make it controversial, but I was going to say, Damien, gave me a small hot take a few weeks ago too, because I think we might differ right on the panel of is it within the same platform or is it distributed in nature, and I would just say launching Nautobot, we know that the background, right, forking NetBox, I was like that was one of the differences in the vision, right, of the projects and the platforms is, we do believe that the integration of data and automation is great and paramount to really accelerate providing value in network automation, right? Obviously, the counter to that is loosely coupled systems, and if it's automation tool and source of truth, which works great, right, in certain environments. But yeah, I would say we do believe that the tightly coupling nature of automation and data was overlooked, and even going back to the days like before Nautobot at Networks of Code, is we were evolving, we were doing automation, and then it was recognizing there's a data gap, so we needed that, and we had NetBox for some time, but then it was like going further, it was like we need to provide more network automation, and rather than have a plethora of tools get deployed, it was like, hey, this can be done more efficiently and effectively through a platform, and that became Nautobot. So our stance is integration is a good thing, but I think these guys might have a differing opinions.
So I think I agree. Like we need to have a data platform in the middle of the automation platform. To me, there's like the data platform and then the larger automation platform. Back to this car analogy, it's the engine and the car, and I think it's because we're never going to be able to put everything on Autobot. By definition, it has to be solved outside. That's kind of my take nowadays. Like, if we could fix everything or have everything running in Autobot, but just the observability stack that we discussed earlier, I feel like it's always going to be outside. So by this definition, I think we don't have, in my perspective today, any other choice than to fix it outside, and because yeah, that's just the way it is. It's definitely going to be harder to fix it outside, but I don't think we have a choice. And since I have the mic to answer your second question, like what has been the challenges to load the data? I mean, I guess there's the extractions of the data. We could probably talk about it. There's more and more tools. There's been a lot of things, but I feel like there's been more and more APIs coming from the different vendors. I think the second big topic that is dear to my heart is where do we store them? I think what we've seen in my analysis and why we started OpsMill is that today the type of data that we need to store is way beyond what we can actually store out of the box in NetBox and Nautobot. Like there's so many, everybody has different, there's the technical data, just that is actually, there's so many things out there. And then there's the business data that we need to store. And today we have nowhere to store that. And I think finding the right place to store all of that data, I think has been one of the big challenge. And I think you mentioned earlier the study from EMA earlier.
Seamus, yeah.
And I think what came out of it, from my understanding, was most people today that are using NetBox or Nautobot, they have another system outside to store the data that they cannot store in NetBox and Nautobot. And to me, it comes back to like there's really this need to be able to define where you store, and at the end, it's like in those systems that have much more flexible schema, which is again why we started OpsMill and InfoHub. But I think that's been one of the big issues in the space as well.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. That's why we just released service mappings. Check it out. And but all the way back to the original question. So I think it was like, do you need a source of truth in your platform? And when we think about platform, I think it's close to Damien's view, which is like there's a platform and it's a bunch of tools, right? Some of them are combined, some of them are not. And I think it's just worth pointing out that like source of truth is just this word that we made up in networking. Like we've had this for a long time. In the Kubernetes world, it's called Git. In fact, in the entire rest of the world, it's called Git, pretty much, right? Like we've always had something that described that we could collaborate on, that described how we wanted things to look, right? For software, it's the code, and then it becomes an artifact that gets deployed. For Kubernetes, it's a bunch of manifests in Git that gets put through something like Flux, and then that becomes the infrastructure as we saw before. In networking, we have this network source of truth word, but it's always the same thing, right? We've always had this concept, and they have different capabilities, and I'm sure we'll talk about later. I really agree with Damien's point about being able to model high-level primitives, or like things that mean something to the business. And I think on the like getting data in, we don't see it so much as getting data in, but like keeping data, I'm not even going to say synchronized, but like being aware of what's out in the network and what's in your source of truth, and the difference between the two and what that means for your business. And that's why we're investing in a bunch of things that we're investing in. Yeah.
So we are talking about source of truth. Sorry, what? Go ahead.
Okay, so two topics, right? Data population is one thing, okay? And definitely the onboarding of data is its own topic itself. But I want to talk about the latter point, which is data integrity, okay? How do you know that your source of truth actually speaks the truth, basically?
I'm sure everyone's got an opinion on this. So the way that we look at it is that you've really got like a few different inputs to that. So typically the source of truth is actually comprised of inputs from lots of other systems, right? But with a human in the loop, as we call it. So if you imagine like a day zero scenario, somebody from Seamus's study, right, everything's in spreadsheets today. The question they ask us is, how do we get it all into NetBox? Right, so it's like, okay, well, we've got diode and we've got all these different collectors, and there's all sorts of ways you can get that in there, but you've still got to ask yourself the question, like, okay, we pulled it all in, but is it correct? A really simple example of that we see every single time is people go and pull all of their information and put it in NetBox, and then they find out that they've got different naming conventions all over their network, right? So it's just a simple example of why you need a human in the loop. But once you've got it in there, now what you're really doing is you're trying to keep it in sync with these other systems. And that also requires human intervention sometimes. So let's imagine you're using something like NetBox Discovery. And in NetBox, you have a device with an interface, and the interface is up in NetBox. And NetBox Discovery tells you that it's down. You don't just put it down in NetBox, right? You ask yourself the question, should it be up or not? Now, if it should be up, that means there's a problem in the network. If it should be down, that means somebody hasn't updated NetBox. Right? So I think it's about making sure that you can see the differences between the systems and the source of intent, but it's really the humans that have got to guard what's in there.
Yeah, I was going to mention something really quick, and I know you know some of this, but I would say like one of the features in Autobot's probably just maybe a hidden gem. It is the ability to create validators that map to the business rules. But to me, at the end of the day, is when we're asked to validate integrity, like it's a matter of like to define that, right? Can you put it on paper at an organization, enterprise, financial, telco, whatever it is like, can you define what good data integrity is? And then if so, I think a few use cases are A, can you report on it? Can you know what good data or bad data is? Two, what we've seen is be able to inject that logic. So when you go to add that device with a bad host name, or let's say it's actually a bad relationship within, with that's trying to be associated, is try to render that code to be able to not even permit that object from being added, right? We've heard from customers that sometimes that's like a cultural shock, not to allow maybe a project manager to add their data because they're non-technical, to go back and to then figure it out, versus let them add it, then report it on after the fact. But I would say, for me, it's just critical to be able to have the ability to inject those types of validators once integrity is defined for the data. That's more than, is it an IP address, but is it a valid IP address in that region that's owned by this person, owned by this team. So there's a lot more logic versus just the abstract data that it is.
To give maybe another example to that, or an approach, to me, to ensure that the data is correct, you have to use it. And I truly believe that there's a lot more use cases to automation than just config management. But the truth is, to me, if you're not using the data in your source of truth to generate and push changes to the network, then it's just a documentation. And it's going to be really, really, really hard to actually believe that it's the truth and it's correct. The only way to me, do that is to make sure that it is used to configuration management and have a way to, at some point, compare what is actually being generated by your source of truth, your system, and what's actually on the network, and do a diff, or basically close the loop, to make sure that it's kind of what Mark was saying earlier. There's going to be a lot of tools that will look at that, but I think at the end of the day, the easiest is still generate the configurations and compare them with the one you have on your network, and that will be very easy to actually highlight any difference. And that's probably the best way that I know today to know that if the data in the source of truth is actually correct or not.
Okay, thanks for the answers. And I just have a follow-up question, and I'm not going to interrupt the panel anymore. So you mentioned actually the data consumption aspect of things, right, on the SOT. Once we're talking about automation, and you mentioned like right now it's mainly driven by configuration management, I've been talking about observability. The source of truth is kind of becoming like the heart, okay, of the lifeblood of what network operations or orchestration is going to look like. That's going to be configuration management, assessment, troubleshooting, observability, so on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, it's a really big topic, data integrity, to be put on the forefront of all these products, right? Like you need to make sure that whatever data I'm consuming, I trust it, okay? I was giving an example that in order for me to actually connect to X database and be able to actually trust that data, I needed to build a script of like almost 200 lines just to make sure that the device had the necessary data sets or the necessary attributes in order for me to do my own automation. So that means that basically I don't trust the information that is actually stored there, right? And there are different methods, and there are different architectures and so on. My follow-up question is, how much do you value data integrity in your products, and what plans do you have around like improve it or put it on the roadmap for them?
So it was, how much do you value data integrity in your products, and how, if at all, are you planning to improve it?
And if you have plans to keep continuing growing on top of it.
Okay, I went first last time, so we can open it up, or I can go first again.
There's so many ways to answer that. I'll take one. I'm sure you guys will take different approach, but I think the first one is actually having a proper schema. I think we're back to a lot of the integrity come from the schema. Like that's the definition of the schema. To say, for example, I'm gonna pick at NetBox because everybody loves NetBox. But like, for example, in NetBox, if we look at the schema, the name is optional. Everybody hates that in NetBox. How come is it possible to not have a device that doesn't have a name? And the issue is because the schema is too generic. I think it's one of the issues we've seen over and over is if you use a schema that is too generic, that is meant to fix 4 different use cases, then everything is optional. Then you cannot trust that to actually do the first of all validations on your data. And I think that's a big problem today that we have is, and you're back to schema extensibility. Today, to be able to have an extensible schema, we try to make everything optional. and that, I don't think that's the right approach to how we're going to fix that. But I'll just start with that. Maybe I'll jump on another topic. But schema management, I think, is the big one.
Yes, schema might play a part, but I'll just kind of bring back sort of like the business validation rules that likely needs to be added in some level of code anyway, based on organizational differences across a global organization. And but I was going to say, as far as like investment and going forward, this isn't, not to make a segue into AI, but this is an area that I do think over the next 18, 24, 36 months, right? A lot of the tool sets, and some already exist out there that have been out for many years, that AI to be able to analyze that data and provide recommendations like based on thousands or millions of objects. Like, can you provide sort of a rating of integrity? I do think AI is going to help quite a bit, but otherwise, schema, no schema, I think the business logic is going to continue to play a critical part to be able to define that like per organization.
So I agree with Damien. You should not be able to have unnamed devices in NetBox. Let's start a petition and get that feature request going, because it drives me crazy. But you can, yeah. You can also have generic objects for circuit terminations. There are other things like that, right? But what I think, I tend, like the computer scientist in me tends to agree with Damien, right? Like at the end of the day, if it can't get past the schema, then it's safe, right? But there is also, validation, which is super important. I think, I really like having a little Damien love party here, but I really like the idea of it's right because you use it. Like, I haven't heard that before. But you also asked, like, what are we doing to improve this? So I think, we're going to start a feature request so we can't have unnamed devices in that box, right? That's the first thing. I just need like 20 thumbs up and it'll definitely happen. But no, I mean, I think, Damien and OpsMill have been able to take a look at what we've been doing and sort of start fresh with some really good ideas. And I think there's a lot of, I think that's, those ideas are bouncing around in all directions, right? And I would definitely expect to see more schema customizability in NetBox over time.
Yeah, I will just say on that comment, going from NetBox to Autobot to InfraHub, and in general, one of the things that maybe isn't a topic for today, but it's just seeing how competition drives innovation. And we've seen a lot of that back and forth over the last couple of years, and having multiple platforms is just an amazing thing to give choice, but also sort of makes us all better along the way.
Yeah, and this will stop at some point as well, which is the depressing thing about it. I don't know if anyone was around for the Docker Core OS wars, or the Mesosphere Kubernetes wars, right? But they were exciting times as an end user because there was still a lot to fight for. At a certain point, things start to stabilize and there's not so much moving anymore. But right now in network automation, everything's changing on a monthly basis, and it couldn't be more exciting.
Okay, so a follow-up question perhaps related to the source of truth and related to Kubernetes. Let's make an analogy here. I mean, Kubernetes has its own intent base. You're passing the intent, it attempts to apply it, and you can see what is the result. I mean, there's a reconciliation loop, somehow similar to what Damien was describing. So how does it compare to a reconciliation loop in network automation? Is it exactly the same or not? And what can we learn from Kubernetes as a project? So the success of the project as an open source project, right? But also from the technical perspective.
Well, I was the marketing chairperson for the Cloud Native Computing Foundation from 2016 to 2020, so I was pretty close to Kubernetes becoming a big deal. I think basically what happened there was, if you go to 2015, there were probably 70 different container orchestrators, right? You haven't heard of most of them. I just mentioned Kubernetes and Mesosphere, but there's also Fig, and then there's Docker Compose, and then Docker had a thing, Swarm, right? There were loads of these. And I think in the end, the best model won, right? The difference there is that Kubernetes was donated by Google to the Linux Foundation, and say 6 large enterprises, huge enterprises, and now hundreds, all decided to work on it collaboratively together on the same approach. I don't think that's happening here, but probably the same ideas will be shared. So one of the core ideas, there are basically 2 core ideas in Kubernetes that made it stand out from all of the other container orchestrators. The first is labels, amazingly enough, because it turns out that with tags or labels, you can make arbitrary hierarchies of information about things. And the second is that everything would be declarative. There's a bunch of other stuff, pods. I think declarative is certainly what we see people moving towards, right? Because really what you're saying is, I have a source of truth. That is my intended state, or some transformation of that is my intended state, and then other stuff is going to figure out how that works underneath. So I think that is certainly a pattern that we'll see hold here as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about, we call it data-driven compliance, and I'll kind of go one step further for the declarative state of making networks more declarative. And I think this hasn't been too common, I feel like, in the past year or two, but a couple of years ago it was always about configure replace on a device, or do you do it in sections, and the holy grail was to do a full configure replace and treat network devices more as cattle, right, coming from the DevOps space. And I think with where we are with Nautilbot and some of the applications that are built with it and around it, it is sort of like data first, generate intended configuration. We get the actual, and it kind of dovetails what we were saying earlier. You have to be able to reconcile that, or be able to see what is different. And it was added a year and a half ago, the ability to remediate. And so, to be quite honest, like that functionality is there today. There's human integration or interaction to do reconciliation, right? Networks, right? A little more fragile, and based on technologies used, like some of that is there today, but it's just a matter of to be able to close that loop, build enough trust after you're seeing what would change. So a little bit more of taking baby steps to get there. But yeah, I suspect the future is near to be able to, in certain types of networks or certain environments, maybe even greenfield to call them out, is to be able to continuously check. So that way, if a human makes a change on a device, we should feel that we're able to be declarative and overwrite it. And if not, given the risk, then flag it, right? I think given where we've been is treating every change as a snowflake, or now if it's violating a compliance rule, I think culturally and philosophically, we haven't been there as an industry yet to be able to override. But we do continue to improve. But some of the tooling is getting built as we speak.
Not sure there's much right. I think the declarative part is the key. I think as an industry, we probably don't talk enough about it. I'm actually surprised to see that there's a lot of people that still don't understand declarative versus imperative and the different approaches. And I think like declarative requires to have a place where you store the expected state. So that makes the source of truth kind of mandatory in this system. And but I think that's the biggest shift that we're seeing in the industry. And we're talking earlier about how do you know your data is actually good. In my mind, I was kind of already assuming a declarative approach, because if you're doing imperative, it's almost impossible. So, but it's a good reminder that we should probably do more educations on that. I think there's still a lot of people that don't think this way.
Yeah, one more comment. I was bringing up Ansible because it has been so common in the past decade. Or a couple of years ago, deploying network configs via Ansible, it was maybe define your VLANs in the YAML file and ensure they're there. But there wasn't any assurance that we're going to remove the ones that shouldn't be there, even if the ones move it from a YAML file to a database. So how do you just start to purge those extra configuration parameters that shouldn't be there? Again, this was toggles and Booleans and Puppet and so forth years ago, and I think it's similar in networking as we continue to evolve. But really think about that in the sense of even as a network automation journey, first ensure what should be there is there, What happens after that, I do think, is per organization. Like, do you want to purge what shouldn't be there? Right. Again, we've been in this very fragile state of networking, but you have to kind of build that journey. But like that definitely is the goal, to be able to be declarative and remove what shouldn't be there, as well as ensuring what is there should be there.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else that you want to discuss about source of truth in general? Because I have another section about data models and related to schemas, but about the source of truth, is there anything else that you would like?
I'm still waiting for the question about version control.
He wants his immutability.
I was kind of actually alluding to the version control aspect of things, because on the data integrity aspect of things, the vision on this, on most of these tools, is that are human-driven, based on it's a human element filling the database, right? Which are error-prone as well. There might be a data pipeline that might be built in and be able to push the data into your source of truth. So one of the few things that I'm kind of hoping to have is a better pipeline mechanism to feed the information that is coming into this source of truth. So how can you ensure that the data, like for example the validator, such sort of things, how can you ensure with help, for example with version control, to get that, right? And the other bit that I would say, maybe this is more of a advice, is that make more public practices for people on how to actually build that better data pipeline, a better data onboarding into the software. Because the truth is that the systems are becoming widely more used, and a lot of critical systems are now going to be depending on this data. So yeah, data integrity again. So sorry about that.
Go ahead.
Now you have to answer. Now you have to answer. Let me ask you, can you have a source of truth without version control?
I think you can, because for a long time we didn't have that. But I think if we go back to, I think it was Mark points earlier, for most people outside of the network industry, Git is the default source of truth. And for me, the reasons why so many people have been using Git is first because it has the most extensible schema, because the definition, it doesn't have a schema. And
We can call your device nothing.
and because it has version control, and there's been all of these, tooling and validations and CI pipelines around it that has become, I think, cornerstone features for infrastructure management nowadays. Like in the world of DevOps, no one would expect to run things without version control. And I think for a long time, this technology, which is honestly Git is amazing. I love Git. It's just but it's only limited to files, text files, and we kind of we used it in a way where it was not intended to, as by using it as a database, because that was the only option for a long time. And I think in the last few years, and in many different ways actually, and I think we should educate people more on the different ways, because I think it's interesting, the three solutions have been working on it in three different ways. There's completely different implementation. I found that very interesting. I think, that's back to these innovation things. And now we're seeing actually this version control capabilities coming to the world of databases, where we can have proper schema, we can have query engines, and we can also have some form of version control in that environment. I think it's super exciting. I think it opens new doors, and now we're building applications around that, and all the things that previously were limited to text files, now we're getting them on a super power of an enterprise application, enterprise database. And that was one of the foundation of what we did at Infra, but again, I know you guys are excited about it too.
We are. I'll let you go first. I'm super excited about it. I'll wait.
No. What I was gonna say is, I think the world with versioning, with the source of truth is going to be a great thing. I think the last 20 years with ServiceNow or ITSMs with CMDBs, I think we've seen that you can go pretty far, and I'll say meet users where they are on their journey. But yeah, I do think to the point earlier around testing and having branches to be able to simulate bulk changes, it is going to add a lot of value. So we're looking forward to it for sure. But the one point that I'll bring up is, I do like to decouple the discussion in sort of version control, but also with approvals, right? Again, we do spend a lot of our time talking with enterprises, and I would say even looking at both of those, we definitely see probably a greater need right now for enterprises to have approval processes around the data being changed, even if it was outside of a branch. But yeah, I would say better together, valuable approvals on their own. And I do think when these solutions start to get adopted, it's gonna create some new outcomes for users. And I would just say to make sure those outcomes are well understood. Is it testing? Is it bulk changes? Is it staging? Just be able to really think through those and make sure there is predefined patterns that can be rolled out. That way, it knows how to be adopted right internally.
Go for it.
I mean, just to actually, that's a very important point. Is maybe again, that's my perspective, but I think in the industry, there's still a lot of people that don't understand or know what is version control. I'm sure everyone heard about it, everyone heard about Git, but it's one of those tools, if you haven't used it yourself, you probably don't really understand the patterns. And I remember doing some automation workshop with directors and VP of different organizations in terms of management. And I actually spent time explaining that. And I think they were genuinely, there was a lot of new information for them. And I think it's very important that we do more education in our space too, so that directors and managers and VP actually understand the shift in mindset around version control, how important it is. It's not just the technology, it's the ability to test in isolation, the ability to have peer review, the ability to have trustability. There's an human aspect that is way beyond the technology. I think a big part of the industry still doesn't understand. And sometimes it's so obvious when you use it every day or when you use it a few times that you don't realize that someone that never used Git, and there's a lot of people that never use Git in our industry, still don't get that. So,
yeah, 100% agree. And I was actually going to go to just defining what we mean by version control. For me, Git has now become synonymous with version control, or actually GitHub has become synonymous with version control. And really, what it's about is collaboration. So as soon as you've got more than one person working on something, you get a risk where, well, what if we both change the thing at the same time? Right? There's a stepping on toes problem. So what we found out as an industry is the best way to collaborate is to work on separate copies of the same thing. But then we have a separate problem, which is how do we know the difference between the two? Which is why we speak about diffs all the time. It's why mutability is very important, because I want to know exactly what version are you using, not kind of what version are you using, because otherwise I can't debug what you're doing. So really the whole reason we got this in the first place is because multiple people needed to work on the same code. And now what we're seeing is multiple people need to work on the same intent for their networks. And that's why a lot of these things are coming through, right? It's all about collaboration, safe, repeatable, immutable.
Yeah, just thinking about actually your question before we were going to pivot, and I think we changed it. Really, I was going to bring up before we changed topics. I was going to bring up other use cases that I don't think we covered. One was data enrichment that we talked about earlier. I think it's super key, right? When we think about intent as the main use case, I do think it's really important to think about how we can use this metadata to enrich logs and metrics. So I try to kind of call that out and bring it to light again, since we're not talking about source of truth. And number two is what we're seeing a lot about is just lifecycle management of overall assets. I think case in point, configuration management comes up a lot, but even the ability to track things like EOX dates, end of sale, end of life, as an example, and even starting to look at financial data to be able to understand maybe the cost of a device or an asset, the cost of a new location, to bring more of that insights and visibility to a data platform, is we're seeing a lot of demand for that. Even how do you replace devices and how do you RMA devices and make that more intuitive within platforms? So just sort of like not always maybe in the automation umbrella, but once you have kind of a trusted data source, you want to be able to do more and more, right, with that data.
Maybe also auditing, right? I mean, who did what, when, and how, right? I mean, this is like auditing, being able to know who changed something is sometimes
Yeah,
important.
exactly. I would say, we hear, again, it's funny, right, our sort of like discussion points versus hearing it from users and customers, but yeah, I would say compliance and audit is probably number one in the sense of like being able to, look at all the changes, right, on a given object or on a given device over the last 6 months, whatever it might be, in addition to sort of the configuration changes, on that, on a given network or a device. But compliance and audit, having that data central, like this is where we get into our philosophical differences across the industry around like intent versus like we have use cases that it's more of a cache, right, to bring data in, and so it flips it a little bit. But the use case it really gives is being able to do audits in a single location. So I do think it's good to call out both of those, because based on where you are on that journey, like it might be intent from day one, it might be bring it in, flip it day 2, or year 2, whatever it might be. But I would say audit and compliance is having data in one location. It becomes that much easier.
Is it still a source of truth if you're just using it as a cache?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And I want to just settle this
Marketing
one.
hat on, sure.
So there is, I think actually Jeremy wrote this and put it on the GitHub somewhere, which is why it's like, thou shalt not push stuff into NetBox. And it's like, well, actually a ton of people do. And one of the great reasons for that is, we had this public use case, Nutanix, and it's a networking team, and they were constantly getting all these questions from their security team, like which versions of which OS is deployed on which devices at which time. So they just pull everything every night and put it in NetBox so they can query it. There's nothing wrong with that. You could also call it automation, but it's not really what we've been talking about here.
Yeah, here I like to say it flips it in the sense of source of truth has implicitly inferred intent. Here, the dynamic is we're discovering data and putting it in a source of truth tool. So can we call it source of truth? Yeah, it is nuanced. And like my final statement there is, if you're solving problems, it's a good day.
Right. Yes. Although I will say that most of the things we're investing in are for using it as intent.
As an industry, I think we still need to find a better name for that. Source of truth just sucks.
Well, it used to be called single source of truth, and we got rid of that. So we're making slow progress.
Yeah, there's something personally I just quick one. I actually I love this topic. I love to see more in the industry. Is if you look at other industry, there's a lot of talking about what they call knowledge graph, which is about putting a lot of data in the same system, having a single schema, and making sure the data are properly connected with each other, and we can query them in a proper way. And there's a lot of industry. Actually, there's an entire industry built around that. And I'm surprised that in our field we don't talk more about it, because to me, what NetBox started was a network graph for the infrastructure. Honestly, that was the real one of the big innovation that NetBox started, was to bring the IPAM and the DCIM together in the same database and being able to have those objects connected with each other. So to me, it was really a knowledge graph to the infrastructure. I think we should kind of try to, there's a lot of educational materials on that out there, and I just find that sad that we're not talking more about it, but that's the real one, 0. Like the one that are very successful with automation, they don't let people touch, or if they do, they kind of add a flag that says this device is not managed by automations anymore, and until someone resolves it. But I think the real environments, 0.
Yeah, I think Yeah, I never, I'm not a fan of like absolute words and 0 or 100, but I would just say, like, given where we are in our approach, it is more like feature by feature, and we call it like a Christmas tree view, green and red in the sense of compliant, not compliant. So I was thinking about how do we meet customers users where they are. So it's being able to generate the intent, right, for a given feature, ensure that it's there, and if somebody were to make a change manually, all right, I'd love to say it's it's 0 even in those cases, but it's not. Like, you're troubleshooting and operations might have to change something, but it's sort of that you have it, the reconciliation process, the reporting process to know, right the next day or right after, based on your schedule. That way you can immediately like reconcile that device. I think it's having the approach so you don't have to have it the full device or nothing to make it a gradual path for automation adoption.
So just one question to clarify your question, Benoit. Do you mean that a user connects manually to configure via CLI or automate via CLI?
Let me take an example. There was a flooding in one of the cities here in Spain, right? So I spoke with the operator. He told me the priority is to get networking up and running. So people are going directly on the router, on the CLI, to just make it happen because it was a high priority. So as a consequence, this is an example, maybe it's extreme, but when I ask, what is your source of truth? What is your inventory? And some people tell me it's a network because people keep changing the CLI all the time, directly manually, not automating for the CLI. And this is one of the biggest issue that we have, which is that it's a process issue. I know of only 2 companies who are telling, if you change a CLI, you might be fired, right?
I was going to say process maybe, but it is knowledge and time. What you're saying isn't surprising. Data center build has to go up in 2 months. They don't have the skills or the knowledge, time to go learn it. That is what is going to be said. So I guess I'm not surprised by it, but I think, as you're asking the engineer, I would probably look at it, going, manager, director, executive, to try to see what they're doing to be able to up-level, their teams. Otherwise, I guess I would just say it's not surprising. I've heard the same thing numerous times because like there's business priorities, and that's to stand up a new colo or a data center. If there's nothing before it, like it is rare, especially if it's the time crunch is already there, equipment's already ordered. Right, if there's 6 months or a year, maybe. So,
I think actually it's very related to all the things we discussed earlier. It's like, so first I think it really depends on the customer. I would guess that, SP tier 1, tier 2, it's probably harder for them because there's so much history to get to a point where they can have a full declarative system that will define how the configuration should look like. In this environment, it's probably harder for them to say, okay, make no changes in CLI. But there's actually a lot of organization in enterprise on greenfield environments, brownfield environments that got to a point where they're able to 100% generate the configuration from their automation platform. And then it becomes actually quite easy to say you cannot change the device anymore. And if someone does, it's just get overwritten the next time. I've seen dozen of organizations that are actually that are at this stage, like not just the FANG, like I've seen organizations where the entire network is actually in Git and managing Git, and they use like full CI/CD and infrastructure as code mindset to manage their network, and in the enterprise, in a lot of different ways. Like, but again, maybe I'm guessing wrong, but I definitely see service provider having a slightly different challenge in that space, just because of the size of their configurations and how much, complexity there is to their configuration. But I'm sure it's possible.
I'll disagree with that. I'll not disagree, just agree with that, which is I've seen a ton of people switching off CLI access, but really it's a scale. Like let's assume you have a brownfield network, because most people do, and you don't have a source of truth. Well, by definition, the network is the truth at first, right? Unless you remembered it all and you can type it in. So you start with the network being the truth, and then you get like what we call a baseline of intent, right? It's like first best guess. But we see companies taking ages to get to the point where everything is being automated and they actually switch off SSH access or do the overwrite approach, because automating the network is not the goal of the business. Right? The goal of the business is to run a business, and it needs a network for that. So if you haven't made your automation easier than just SSHing in, then the network will remain the truth. Right? So really, it's a process problem, it's a people problem. But I think, the successful companies that we see going through this, they tend to take either a horizontal approach or sort of a vertical approach. They will say, okay, we're going to automate everything in this site, for example. Or they will say, we're going to go and automate this type of infrastructure across all sites. And then, some things remain difficult, especially with like really gnarly legacy infrastructure. But over time, the amount of stuff, this is to the point earlier about it being gradual, right? You don't want to just switch everything off because now the business doesn't run anymore. So you need to find a way to make it easier for people to go through the process instead of SSHing straight in and then switch it off behind them.
Yeah, I was just gonna make another comment, on that in the sense of like even taking like a retail organization or, if there's an urgent, like to be empathetic, I think it's so important, we don't want to live in our ivory tower in this room, right, to disable SSH access or CLI, but if there's truly an urgent business request, Mark's point is great, it's like they're not automating for the sake of automating, but if there's an urgent issue and it has to get fixed manual, maybe the person they have is new, they haven't run the automation system yet, or whatever it is, in the sense of like, you have to ask those questions within that organization to know what is a fallback, but then to build the automation to be able to brownfield discover, reconcile, report on it, and ideally and almost immediately you can add the correct data, right, the observed data back in, or overwrite it. I think like these are the questions that are hard, and I think the answers I think are going to vary per vertical, per business. If the network is your business, right, there's a lot of different nuances in the answer.
So many other topics I want to talk about here, but
Before you do that, sorry, this is a very enjoyable panel, but it's also the longest panel I've ever been on. While Damien's talking, I'm going to go take a pee.
now I'm limited on what. No, sorry. Now, I just want to say that I fully agree, of course, with the everything we build needs to not enforce, like be too restrictive to people. Like we have to build the tools, I think, in a way that empower people, not restrict them. And another thing, I think that, I don't know if everyone realized that, but I think having a source of truth is actually, it's easier to manage exceptions in your automation. Like there's often this idea that automation has to be exactly homogeneous and it has to be exactly the same, and people are saying, oh, I cannot automate because it's not clean enough of an environment. And I think actually having a source of truth, because we have a proper data, that means that you could have a complete mess of a network. If you're able to capture that properly in the source of truth, you could actually automate that. And I think it's been a game changer also in that sense that it's been enabling us to build more better systems that are able to manage one-off and exceptions, and like where previously we would go on CLI and shut an interface or change specific settings for one device, we could technically now do that also like just from the source of truth. And it's not necessarily, if we need to make a quick change, I will still argue that a mature organization should still use the automation system. Just if you have to make it on 2 devices, you probably are better off doing it through automation and capturing it. But anyway, I get that some people are still going to their reflex there.
One more comment. So we can go back and forth in the sense of like getting a scenario where the tooling can't connect to the device. So we always have all the scenarios to be able to make sure the business can continue to run.
Okay.
Question back there, actually.
There's a question?
And one more question regarding this. So it's one more question regarding this whole source of truth and Git being a good idea here. Before I came here, I really thought that Git is a pretty good idea for holding your source of truth and managing like differences. The more I listen to that and the more I think about networks, the less I think it's a good idea to use Git here, because Git was like, no, seriously, like Git was kind of invented to hold this code state, right? And like compiling source code, if you don't change the source code, should always give you the same result. So only if you change it, then the result changes. For a network, configuration that you can obviously hold in Git is only a small part of the state of the network. There's a lot of mechanisms afterwards that change the state. There is like simple things like STP, for example, that will change which links are active. If you then add stuff like bonding, link aggregation, that again changes which links are actually active, that are not represented in your Git tree, and that will also not change or shouldn't change in your Git history only because the network changes. And the higher you go, if you add stuff like BGP or whatever, the more complicated it becomes and the less true or less amount your source of truth holds, basically, in the end, right? So that's I still agree for configuration that's great, but the network is a very different thing. Then you have a very different source of truth. It doesn't cover all of what it is.
That's why the name sucks, but like source of truth, I think we'll agree. I think all of the three of us will agree that it's the definition of the intent, only the intent. For all the live states and data, that's what David presented earlier, you need the observability stack, and it's because the data is not controlled by humans, you don't need the same features, you don't need version control there, you need time series data, you need historical, you need ways to enrich, like very different feature sets, but both data sets are critical, and it's just one that is weirdly named the source of truth, but it's more about the intent than anything.
This the boundary between deterministic and non-deterministic, right? Which is what we also try to solve in software testing. Right? So even with normal software testing, you're controlling all of the inputs in your CI/CD pipeline, so you can test the outputs. But once you deploy it into production, now you don't control the inputs anymore because users are doing things. Now, the way we've been solving that in software, another example is like really what this comes down to underneath is like the true reason behind cattle versus pets. Right? And the true reason behind cattle versus pets is because the longer we allow the state to change in a system in a way that is not reflected by the inputs, the more we have no idea what's going on in there. Which is why moving from really long-running bare metal machines to short-running VMs was good. And why moving from short-running VMs to super short-running containers is good, because the amount of time that elapses where something could change that we don't control is less. So when something goes wrong, there are less places to look to figure out what happened. This is one of the fundamental reasons why the road is so bumpy in networking, because you can't just switch out your core routers all the time and say, okay, let's get rid of all the state and all the tables and all the sessions and everything else. You kind of have to deal with some of that. But that is like, I think that's was covered a little bit earlier, right? That is what observability is all about, which is how do we reason about non-deterministic state in systems.
Yeah, just two quick comments, kind of bringing it back to Git. And even skills from earlier. Like this is where I do think I haven't seen users and customers sort of like think they got it right, but it was wrong for their environment in the sense of, let's say there is a small Tiger team. Maybe there's an architect and a few engineers built out the strategy. They build a platform, and then they're wondering why no one's using it. Well, they built it with IAC and it was GitOps based, and no operator knew Git. You know what I mean? So I do think based on where a strategy is in an organization, you have to kind of play it out with sort of like the adoption and the users, and I just come back to sort of just like really knowing from start to finish all the users and how it's going to change their day to day. Because like the worst thing you want is that one example where there's so much investment in the associated tooling, one or more platforms and tools, largely Git based in that one example, but then literally no one's opening pull requests because because they never learned Git. So I just think it's to me it's so obvious to make sure whatever tooling is chosen. If it's a branch within a UI that makes it more streamlined and simpler, great. But otherwise, it's still making sure that way we know how it will be adopted within any given organization.
I'll just add one more little point on that, because I think that's an interesting kind of right turn into building these automation platforms themselves. So we can learn from the past here. So KubeCon, the Kubernetes conference, was mainly about Kubernetes for the first 4 years, and then it was all about what's now called platform engineering, which is basically, oops, we built a bunch of Kubernetes that nobody wants to use. Maybe we should speak to our users. Actually, these days it's all about AI because it's 2025. But like, I think it's a slightly separate point, but it's a good point. Like, the automation should be for the users, not for us.
Talking about AI,
Do we have time for AI?
we don't have much time. I had two more questions. One was about data models, standardization, so on. That could be a long one, I think. And there was a completely open-ended, like, what's the role of AI in network automation? Which one do you want to tackle?
That's a hard one for you then. Why? You want to talk about data models later?
No, actually, I love to talk about AI.
Really?
Yes.
I think we can touch on both, I think.
Together? Actually, it's... Let's go for it.
Yeah.
No, so AI, I think there's so many use cases, but the one that I think it's John from, I always get his last name right, so I'm not going to say it wrong, sorry, so I'm not going to say it, but John C. from Selector has been in Capabianco, so, thank you. He's been teasing about those agentic AI. I think it's a very interesting use case that we're seeing in all of infrastructures, like those agents are able to basically troubleshoot on their own and understand how to go from identifying the root cause of the problem to even potentially fixing it, or like really giving superpowers to operators. I was talking with someone earlier just telling me like all their layer 1 ticket at their company, they're actually planning on having agentic AI, do the first steps troubleshooting, collect informations, give them to their team. I think that's one first use case that's going to be very interesting. I think another use case has been one we've been looking at is actually how do we ingest the existing brownfield environments and feed that into the new automation platform, like turn unstructured data into structured data and make sense of the data and clean up the data and all of that, like do all of this analysis that takes a lot of time today. I think that's a huge opportunity for AI. I have a few more, but I don't know if you guys want to throw more.
Yeah, I'll just kind of, maybe I'll tie both together. I do think where we are now in the acceleration of AI, I do think, we've talked about network automation in the past 10 years, I do think AI is going to have a transformative effect on network operations over the next 5 to 10 years. And the skills we're talking about today, if it's like the scripting skills, software skills, are going to be critical to be able to have network automation, be that gap into AI. But no, I think in general, code generation, I'll even call it a quick win, but I think code generation right now is going to be critical, even for things, maybe generating schemas and things like that. If code is required to build a schema, I think we're going to have to be able to build scripts, to build tests for those scripts, to build the pipelines for those. I think we're going to see the advent of more and more code getting generated by AI. There's no doubt. I think agentic AI, not being super deep into it, but I do think in general we're going to see over the next 2 or 3 years a lot of custom solutions, and that are then packaged and commercialized when we start going 3 to 5 years out. But I think now my general message is, where we were with network automation several years ago, I think we're there with at least understanding use cases for a lot of the SaaS-based AI solutions that are out there, like CodeGen as one. If it's even like justifying investments, even if you've even seen things like NotebookLM, right, from Google, like looking at vendor design documents to be able to query design docs and to get inputs and feedback. So I think with where we are now is like starting practical, meeting people with where they are, and then from there I think it'll evolve from the SaaS space to CodeGen, and then going even further with a lot of the more advanced agentic AI solutions, I think will help. And then for us, data platforms, there's no doubt data analysis, data onboarding, compliance, it's going to continue to play a role in data integrity within source of truth.
So we're doing a few different things. I think the main benefit I saw immediately with like ChatGPT, especially from 4 onwards, was just how much faster it made me. So we've now mandated the use of AI at NetBox Labs. So, we write, if you follow our blog, we write a lot of blog posts. Our process for that now is we send it a huge prompt, we see what comes out, we edit it ourselves, and then we push it out. So we're saving 50% of our time. When I'm coding, I code, at least twice as fast now, but I think that's going to be tricky for people who are new to coding because it can get you into trouble real quick. One of the sort of superpowers I found with this is don't go too far before you write some unit tests for what it's done, because otherwise, if you're like, oh, I'm sure that works, because it spat it out, and then later you find out it's doing something really weird. But for anything like just remembering how little things work, it just helps you to sort of go at the speed of thought a lot faster, and it's definitely helping us out. And then on the sort of NetBox side, the first thing we released was the enrichment API, which is basically, let's say you want to send a monitoring alert, and it says, I don't know, problem with interface on device 1, right? So you send that, whatever the alert description is, to the endpoint. It looks in NetBox, it's easy if it can find it. It pulls a bunch of information out. You can have it in free text, or you can define a JSON schema if you would like it to return it in. And then you can add that as sort of enrichment to an alert message is one way to do it. The second thing we've done is upgrade Risk Analyzer. So if there are any NetBox users here, you'll know that we occasionally break things when we move to new versions. What the upgrade Risk Analyzer does now for our enterprise and cloud customers is it looks at their API logs, it looks at their change logs, basically looks at what they've been doing, installed plugins and everything else, and you say, I'd like to go from this version to that version, and it tells you all the things you should probably be aware of. So that's kind of interesting. And then the new news this week is, there's another one. So the other one is NetBox Discovery. What we find is that often people, they already have config backups, for example, and they want to use config backups to do discovery of their network. Turns out that LLMs are really, really good at reading config backups, especially if you give them like vendor-specific primary prompts. So you can use that. And then just today, on the agentic side, we've released, there's a new thing called LLMs.txt, which is a bit like the old robots.txt that you used to put on to tell search engines how to read your site. And now you publish an LLMs.txt, which tells the LLMs how to interact with your tool. And then there's also something called an MCP server, which does the same thing. So lots of action. I think, it's kind of interesting that this is a new field, and we're not like, none of our companies are like 10,000 people, and we're all heavily investing in this kind of stuff. It's definitely happening. It's happening now, and I recommend getting involved. Yeah.
I wanted to get back, fully agree with that. I wanted to get back to a few things that you were saying, Jason, which I think are very important. Like, you made the point that AI is going to, both of you made the point that AI is going to generate a lot of code. And I fully agree with that, but I think, at least I'm personally convinced that it will never generate, for example, something to the size of a project of a NetBox or NotAbout or InfraHub. Like, I think AI, where it will be really, really good, is to develop on top of, develop small to medium scripts on top of a framework. And I think that's where having properly developed frameworks that are properly documented and all of that will actually really make it easier for people to have the AI, teach the AI how to use those frameworks and do all of that. Recently I was on a podcast, we came up with this term like middle code. I think there's the no-code and low-code platforms that are very, very short scripts. I think with AI, we have the opportunity to have those like 200, 500 line software that AI can develop, but because they're on top of a platform. So I think that means we need to have more framework as an industry, more tools to build on top, and stop like having everybody trying to build everything from the ground up. So I think it's going to be very important. And the second point, back to your data model, Mark, is you mentioned MCP, you mentioned all that. It's all those agentic servers tomorrow. They will need to we'll need to teach them what is our data model so that they can consume it, so that they can interact with it. And I think the importance of having a proper schema, and back to what we're saying, like if we're storing everything as a JSON blob because we don't have any other way to put it, or if every fields are optional because we're actually using the same schema for 10 different things, I think it's going to be really hard for those agents to figure it out. And I think we're going to need to have more and more like properly defined schema, properly documented schema, with every single field being very clearly documented in the schema, because that's going to be what we're going to give those LLMs to teach them how to use. So I think it's going to be more and more important in the future.
I agree with that. On your first point, this middle code idea is really interesting. And I think where it works very nicely is when it's 200 to 500 lines with really clear interfaces. Like without going into like diode and all this other stuff, inside NetBox Discovery, basically these things are responsible for speaking to some other system, pulling data and pushing it back to NetBox, right? So it's very clear scope. And because the interface is already very well designed and static and created by humans, when you ask LLMs to build things for you in there, they do a really good job of it, because it's not like a totally open field. You've already constrained a lot of it, and really you're just asking, solve this specific problem. So I haven't listened to the podcast, but I like the middle code idea. I think that makes sense.
Okay, so I think we don't have more time. It has been a very interesting experience. So thank you to the 3 speakers for this panel. It was a long one. A coffee break is waiting for us. And thank you for the audience for attending NetBCN, this NetBCN event this time. Okay, thank you.
That's a really good one.